Hi, Joe. We can start.
Good morning. I'm Jo Waring. I'm the UK Market Manager for Wines of South Africa. Welcome and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, this webinar and the other insider sessions from this year and last year are going to be available on the Wines of South Africa website and YouTube channel. So if there are any that you'd like to revisit or haven't seen, that's where you can go. So before we begin the main webinar, I'd like to thank our partners WesGrow who have helped make the insider sessions possible. And I'd like to briefly hand over to WesGrow's CEO, Tim Harris, who has a few words to share with you. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Jo, and thanks for the opportunity. For those of you sitting like me here in the Western Cape, you'll know that this is a very apt day to note that saying about wine, that it's sunlight held together with water, because we're having an incredibly beautiful winter's day here in Cape Town after a really lovely weekend. And the great thing is that's happening in combination with fairly decent rain this winter. So this is the best we can hope for, but it's a real pleasure to join you from a sunny Cape Town. And it's been really great to partner with WoSA on the Insider Sessions. This is the third one that we've done to support the South African wine trade globally. And it's really humbling to be part of a session with such an esteemed panel that you're going to be introduced to them in a moment. But thank you firstly to the panel for taking the time to share your insights and your expertise with all of us. And thank you to all of the attendees that are busy dialing in. We're really happy to have you as part of the conversation and to learn together with me about the latest wine trends and how 2021 is shaping up. WesGrow is the tourism, trade and investment promotion agency for Cape Town and the Western Cape. And we're working right now, like many in South Africa, on economic recovery, which is going to be driven by a combination of our products successfully sold around the world, led by our flagship products in the Western Cape, which is our wine, as well as a reopening of tourism as we get the vaccination done to help get those tourist dollars back into our economy. But obviously over the past 15 months, we've become used to dealing with a changing regulatory environment. And we're very pleased that with the new lockdown measures introduced last week, alcohol has been left off, because we together with the wine industry were in the trenches for many months there, trying to mitigate the huge impact of the alcohol restrictions on the wine industry. But it looks like for now, we're having a more sensible policy that recognizes the huge jobs and growth engine that the wine industry is, not just for the Western Cape, but for South Africa as a whole. Wine is our second largest export in the Western Cape. We do almost 10 billion rands worth of exports from here every year. And notwithstanding those regulatory issues, we had a 15% increase in wine exports last year. So that's due to a really competitive industry combining high quality with great value, and the work of our friends at WoSA promoting our wines around the world. Our contribution was to help put together something called the Cape Export Network, which is the first B2B marketplace committed to South African wines. We did it in conjunction with WoSA. We've got 110 wineries on the network, profiling more than 300 wines. And we'd like you to all take a look at the Cape Export Network, as well as if you have wines that aren't listed, make sure you get them on there. This is our contribution to helping to shore up sales under difficult circumstances. But I think, Jo, I'll hand back to you to continue with the panel, because in the end, we're only as good as this incredible product that we produce from our SA wine industry every year. And I think it's very important that we get an update on how that's looking, so that we can continue to drive our economic recovery, leading with our very best product, South African and Western Cape wine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. And now to introduce our next Tim of the day. And I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to our chair, who's Master of Wine, Tim Atkin. And I know that many of you are aware that Tim has a long-standing relationship with the South African wine industry. Despite his very youthful appearance, Tim actually visited the Cape for the first time in 1990 and has seen firsthand how much the industry has changed over those years. He was one of the first globally recognised wine writers to really get under the skin of South Africa and report on the developments and progress within our industry. In 2013, he launched the first of his South Africa reports, and that has become an annual publication that is really one of the most vital commentaries on the South African wine industry worldwide. When he's not talking about South Africa, Tim is also an award-winning wine journalist, writing for the likes of Decanter, Harper's Wine and Spirit, The Drinks Business, to name a few. He's chair of the International Wine Challenge, and most importantly, writes for his own, or has his own website, which is timatkin.com, which is a must-read for both wine professionals and consumers alike. So I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's going to introduce you to our brilliant panel today, and I'm really excited to hear what everybody's going to say. So Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. After that intro, I don't know how much I owe you, but that was very nice of you. The check's in the post, I think. Hello, everybody. Lots of people tuning in from all over the world. Greetings in particular to South African friends who are watching, not just on the panel. I've not been to South Africa, didn't go last year, obviously, and I've not been this year so far, and I'm really missing it. So a big hug to all of you. When Joe and I sat down to plan this session today, Joe said, would you like to do it? And I said, yes, I'd love to. And she said, which winemakers would you like on the list? And I came up with a list of winemakers, and I'm delighted to say that they're all here today. Basically, this was my A team. Even you, Ardy, it's amazing, isn't it, to think you were on my A team, but you were on my A team. I said, let's get a really diverse bunch of people who do different things and make different styles of wines, and more to the point, have opinions, right? So before I tell you how we're going to run the session today, I thought I'd very briefly just ask our panelists to introduce themselves, to say who they are and where they make wine. I think many of them will be very familiar to you already, but to say briefly a little bit about themselves. Ardy, would you like to go first?
Hi, Tim. Thanks very much. And hello, everybody. It's great to be here. And Tim, yeah, there are a lot of people you could have chosen, but I'm honored to be here, and thank you very much for that. My name is Ardy Barnard, and we make wine in the Swartland on the farm called Kalmoesfontein. We've been here since 2008. I made wine in Stellenbosch before that, and yeah, you know, I think my big influences in my career was a guy I worked with in New Zealand, a guy called Brent Maris, who was at Delegates in Wither Hills, and you know, I often think of my grandfather who worked at Groot Constantia. He had a big influence in my career as well. Yeah, but thanks very much for having me, and welcome to everybody else too.
Thank you. Craig, next, please. Needs to unmute himself.
There we go. Thanks, Tim. Also, just quickly want to say thank you to everybody for joining us, and thanks for hosting us, WoSA and Tim. It's a really interesting session up ahead, I think. I hope that you guys watching are going to get something out of it. Not 100% sure why I'm here, but anyway, I am. I'll say what I have to say. Can't promise anything. Enlightening will come of it, but I'll give it my best shot. I'm Craig Wessels. I'm a winemaker at Restless River, and we're based out in the Hemelin-Ader Valley, which is next to the small town of Hermanus. The area is generally known for a sort of a cooler growing region. We focus on Cabernet, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And in terms of influence in the wine industry, I've sort of come in through the back door, so I never really had any older sort of influences in my life. I think I've more been influenced by philosophy and wine style, and aspire to make wines that resonate with that sort of style and philosophy.
Thank you very much. Trizan, next, please.
Thanks, Tim. And it's an honor also to be on the A team. I'm also quite thrilled. Not for wine here, but anyways, thank you very much and welcome everyone. I think, okay, so I'm Trizan Barnard and I'm the winemaker and owner of Trizan Signature Wines. And I started out my own business also in 2008. And before that, I was winemaker at a different company. And I don't own my own wine farm or my own grapes. So I source different grapes from various regions. But my main focus, I'd say, is the cooler climate areas such as Elam and Sonderskloof. And my philosophy around wine, I don't think I have really one school of thought. I think it's a conglomerate of traveling around the world and as an individual and as a younger winemaker back then, kind of shaping you and you kind of finding your way and just becoming your authentic self and making authentic wines.
Thank you very much. Charles Back.
Hi, Tim. Good morning, everybody. I don't know why you selected me, but probably because I'm the oldest on the panel by a long margin. Thanks.
Yeah, you're the most handsome.
Yeah, or you did it alphabetically. I don't know how you did Barnard and Back. There might be a new label moving forward. Anyway, I've been indirectly involved with wine directly for 43 years, my 43rd vintage. So I think I'm probably the longest serving winemaker, still on 2 feet. My grandfather came to South Africa in 1902 and bought his first wine farm in 1916. So our family's been making wine for more than 100 years. My greatest influence has obviously been the integrity that instilled in me by my grandfather, my late father. So that runs right through our business, and integrity in business means also integrity in grape growing and in winemaking. And I think that's the cornerstone of foundation of our business. What influences me the most are my customers and consumers. I'm driven to please their requirements, and that is a prime objective of what we try and do. And that's my story.
Thank you very much. Neil?
All right, so my name is Neil Grunewald. I've been in the wine industry, I think a little shorter than Charles, but yeah, also about 20, 25 years. And currently I'm heading up Nederburg, which is one of the larger wineries in South Africa, and then also part of the Stel Group. So when it comes to influences, then there's various influences, and they also change by time, I think, as you grow older. So I remember a couple of people that I used to phone up quite regularly with the likes of J.P. Bailey, Gary Baumgarten, and then suddenly it comes to a point where people start phoning you, and then you realize that you're actually now getting to become older, and maybe that's why we're on the A team. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to the session and looking forward to hearing from all of you guys. So at the end of the day, for me, it's about not just winemaking, but the business of wine and sustainability. So that's what drives me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody, for introducing themselves. Today's session is about winemaking, obviously, as Joe has already told you, but it's impossible to make wine without grapes. It's a truism, obviously. So I thought we'd start just with a little bit on where and what. And what I'm going to do with each question is address the question to two of the panelists rather than asking everybody to answer the same question, because that gets a bit boring. But if anybody wants to chip in, other panelists, then do feel free to do so. Same thing, please keep your questions coming and I'll try and keep an eye on those whilst we're moving along. The first thing is about where, really. And as Joe said, you know, I first went to South Africa back in 1990. I was obviously extremely young there. And I think what we've seen over the last 30 odd years has just been incredible development, discovery and renaissance in some cases of different areas, really. You know, you look back to 1990 and maybe Charles will talk a bit about this. You know, the Swartland was pretty much unknown for fine wine. The first question I wanted to ask was just the changes that have happened over the last 30 years in terms of these areas that have been developed or redeveloped or discovered. Has it changed your ideas about which varieties and wine styles work best in specific places. And I wanted to ask Charles first of all, and then Neil really to answer that question, just to give us an overview of areas and how their views have changed in that time. Charles, do you want to go first?
That's a very complicated and difficult question to answer in the short space.
I like to challenge you.
And you know, I'm involved in grapes from Pekingese Kloof to Plettenberg Bay, so it's that broad a range and scope. And having said that, in the 90s we were restricted mainly to, let's say, the traditional grape growing areas, which are about 4 or 5 appellations. And it opened up to when the quota system dropped and you can plant grapes where you wanted to rather than where you were told to plant them. And things started opening up, and with that opened up a whole tapestry, a whole canvas actually for winemakers to fill in. And you could try a whole host of different varieties which you didn't try before. And if you take a simple variety like Sauvignon Blanc, which has become quite an important component of the South African white wine industry today, and it's very terroir specific. And if you can see where we got it planted today, where Trizan works down in the South Cape all the way to Darling, we find enclaves of excellence. And the same goes for Pinot Noir. I think Craig works in an area known for Pinot Noir, which wasn't there 35 years ago. It didn't exist. And look at the great Pinot Noirs coming from that part of the world. Then, of course, we've got workhorse varieties like Shiraz, which is a chameleon. It changes its character and characteristics as it migrates from area to area. In the cooler areas, you find it being spicy, and in the warmer areas, the more fruit-driven style. And in between, you find a whole host of different styles. So I think South Africa is today for a winemaker's paradise, because you can come here and you can focus on any variety you want, and you will find a region that suits that variety. And I think our challenge moving forward, as this things start to distillate down to getting to ultimate quality, we'll marry varieties more closely with where they suited moving forward. And I think we will then have we'll reach the pinnacle of what we're capable of doing with the knowledge we've gained in the last 30 years, but fine-tuning in the next decade.
Fantastic, thank you. Neil, could you answer the same question, please?
Right, I want to echo what Charles has said, and just maybe for a bit of context, in the 1990s, so 30% of all grapes harvested were actually used for wine production. And the rest was used for either distilling purposes, brandies, silver stable grapes. And in the early 2000s, it swapped around from 70 to 70% for wine production and 30% then for the balance. And what this has definitely showed us is the new areas that's come along, but also our exposure to markets and new markets. So, and there was one specific time period that I think taught us a lot, and that was when there was a red wine shortage, and there was a shortage of vines as well, and good quality vines. So everybody was planting red wines, and you'll see the wines that are still in the vines that are still doing well is the ones that's still in the ground. So the rest have been pulled out because they just were sap quality. But yeah, in those days everything actually worked. So when it comes to changing my mindset, I mean, we're constantly exploring new areas. We've got some beautiful plantings high up in the Ceres Karoo, and to also just push those boundaries. But at the end of the day, it's about what works on the farm, and that's actually distilling itself out. So I think if you take out that whole production-driven era that we had prior to the 90s, and then you take out the bubble of artificially just planting red wines for the market. And now that people are replanting, again, you can see that they're planting what works on the farms. And that's really what's special. Then you see how it crystallizes between Durbanville and Elgin for cooler climate varieties, Stellenbosch maybe for cabs, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I agree with both of you. I just think this marrying of wine style to place is something we'll explore a bit more throughout the chat. In fact, you know, I'd like to talk about the word terroir. There was a wonderful book that was published for years in England where the word terroir was obviously some sub-editor had decided that this wasn't the word they wanted to use and changed it to terrier all the way through the book. So instead of terroir, it's terrier. So I sometimes think of terroir as terrier. It's a French word, obviously, and it's often used in a French context for marketing reasons, but also I think to identify this sort of sense of place. I suppose I want to ask, does this term mean anything in a South African context? I'd like to ask Craig and Trizan. Trizan, if you'd like to go first, just to give us some examples of terroir, particularly you first, Trizan, talking about different plots that you buy, because as you said at the beginning, you don't actually have any vineyards of your own, and how those places are reflected in the wine styles you make, please.
Yeah, Tim, just to answer the question, that is it, can we apply terroir in South Africa? I definitely do think we can. And I think it comes down to the diversity of South Africa. We are incredible diverse grape growing region. And, we've got incredible soils, and we've got different aspects, and our proximity to the oceans plays a big role. So yes, environmental factors play an incredible role in our styles of wine. And if I have to apply it to where I get my grapes from, just let's work on Sauvignon Blanc, because it's one of my major grapes. If I look at it in the Edam area versus the Sonderskloof region or ward, which is not that far apart from each other. They're literally probably about, as the crow flies, probably about 30 to 40 kilometers apart from each other, but very different. They're both cool climate areas. If you have to compare certain blocks, clonal and rootstock could be exactly the same. Farming practice could be very similar, but what I get in the grapes, completely diverse. And I think it is absolutely because of the environmental impact where those grapes are situated. If I look at Elam, we've got this proximity to the big ocean masses, the Indian Atlantic Ocean. We've got extremely big winds there, prevailing winds. And this has a huge role on our growing season, especially with Sauvignon Blanc. So we've got this extended growing period, which plays definitely into the aromatics of the Sauvignon. Then I go to Sonderskloof, just 40 kilometers inland, a little bit more, also on the Indian Atlantic Ocean, and completely different fruit profile. So terroir is definitely important in South Africa. I'm talking about regions quite close to each other, but if you go far, if you go to a warmer region versus and a cooler region, like Charles said about Syrah, Shiraz, and I have to compare my Elam Shiraz versus my Swartland Shiraz, that is because of climatic conditions and all the elements that are part of terroir. Yeah. So there's definitely.
Yeah, it might be interesting, just quickly, I want to ask Neil to come in on this, because the picking window in South Africa, what's the earliest you'd start? Some years you might even be picking in December, wouldn't you? But certainly January. And then we would be going in the really cool areas, and Trizan, I don't know, or Neil, we'd be going into what, late April even?
Yeah, so for picking, definitely it depends on your portfolio as well. So on our side, we start maybe the second week of January. Yeah. So with some bubbles, and you end up with noble age harvest that can be normally close to Easter. I firmly believe anything that's after Easter still in the vineyard should stay there. So, but yeah, it's okay. It can be till April.
All right, so I wanted to bring you in, Craig. Let's get a point of view from you on terroir. And then Craig is one of possibly the only person in the world who grows Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Cabernet, world class in all three cases, in the same place. Tell us a little bit about terroir in your particular bit of the world, because I think vineyard visits with you are always fascinating.
So I think the cooler Himmel Order is really synonymous with cooler climate varietals like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So you would expect those varietals to come out of this area. But I think I'm on my 17th vintage of Cabernet now. So you wouldn't really expect Cabernet Sauvignon to come out of an area like this. It's just not what we've been told happens. And I don't think so much it's a case of not being able to do it. I just think that it's very, very difficult to do, and sometimes it's not really viable to do it either. So Cabernet coming out of the Himmel Order is a bit of an anomaly. However, if you're prepared to exercise patience and you're not pushing for yield, it can be done. It's fairly extreme environment for Cabernet in the sense that Cabernet is such a late ripener. So Neil was commenting earlier about anything on the vine after Easter should stay on the vine. Well, often we haven't even started harvesting by Easter. So we're a little bit of an exception.
I was about to say, it hasn't been through Verizon when you get to Easter, right?
So we're a bit of an exception out here. But, with the concept of terroir, I think that it's, you can embrace it, and you can try and reflect that philosophy in your wines, or it's not really that important to you. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I think there's just certain wines that can be more terroir driven, and there are other wines that you just want to drink and not have to even think about its wine of origin.
Yeah.
With terroir, I always think of or say to people who perhaps don't see the importance of terroir, or who don't even believe it exists. I do remember there was some UC Davis professor who wrote a book called Terroir and Other Wine Myths. So
yes, he did.
It's pretty clear what his view was. But I always just say to him, go plant a banana tree in Oslo. Tell me if terroir is a myth.
Yes.
So clearly, if you just open your eyes and look around at nature, and unfortunately in this country we're so diversified in terms of our environment. You just open your eyes and look around, and you can see that certain species of plants thrive or struggle in certain places, and vine is no different. Some vines will thrive, or some vines will struggle in certain areas, and then you can distill that all the way down to your particular patch of land. And not to carry on talking too long, but in terms of the terroir, Trizon and I actually, I think, strive for very similar things in our wines, but our building blocks are completely different in the sense that I only make wine from the grapes that I grow on my farm, and Trizon is sourcing parcels from all around. But I think that we still have a similar philosophy in what we're trying to do.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Somebody's asked a question about sustainability, and we're not going to touch on sustainability because there was a whole panel on sustainability. So, I'd love to talk about it, but this is really a winemaking discussion and a little bit more about terroir. The next thing I'd like to move on to is what really, in terms of what's grown where. And if you look at the list of South African grape varieties, I'm not going to bore you by reading them out, but 16 varieties account for 92.5%. So, and the other, there are 70 altogether in South Africa, so the other sort of 54 or whatever make up the remaining 7.5% of that. So what I want to ask now, I'm going to bring in Adi for the first time. He's been waiting very patiently in his wonderful office, is given the ongoing effects of climate change, does South Africa have the right mix in its vineyards, and are we going to see big changes in the next decade or 2 decades? Adi.
Oh, Tim, thanks. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question, and a very pertinent question, of course. We've been doing a bit of research on the varietals available in South Africa at the moment, and we've come up with a list of around about 110 varietals that are now available in South Africa.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And if you look at a place like Australia, they've got a strong drive in terms of new varietals. They've got access to almost 170 different varietals. But obviously, choice of varietals is going to play. It's going to be very important as we try and predict or see what climate change is going to do, in the next couple of years. And farmers have got very short memories. Now, I've got a particularly short memory, and I tend to, forget the drought and the heat after a sensational vintage as we've just had here in 2021. But I do know that if we normally get about 15 to 17% of our rainfall during our growing season, if that were to change, it would have a serious impact in what we decide to plant in the future. And we all know that South Africa has only been planted to a couple of varieties, and the varieties that generally sell.
What are those? Sort of Chenin, Cabernet, Sauvignon Blanc,
Cabernet, Shiraz, Merlot, that kind of thing, Chardonnay.
Yeah.
But there are obviously amazing varietals out there that will work in South Africa. But, you know, Charles alluded to it earlier, is that, you know, the big changes in farming are going to be driven by obviously climate change, but more importantly is probably consumer demand for these different varietals. So the change here is going to be a lot slower varietal mix change. Currently, there's quite a serious uprooting program happening in South Africa because of Corona, loss of markets. So there's a lot of uncertainty going forward, and it's very difficult for me to. I know what in my heart I'd like to plant and work with. Can
you tell us? Share it. Share it with us.
No, look, what works really well here so far in our particular area is obviously a lot of the Portuguese varietals, you know, the bigger berry varieties. But there's stuff like, I don't know, Baga. I think it would be amazing to see Romisco here, for example. You know, it could be a wonderful grape. But there's amazing Italian varieties as well that could work, you know, not just from the south. But you know, to find the right place to plant them, we all know that these need to be planted in the right place. It's fantastic working with old vines that happen to be planted in the right place. But the new stuff, we really need to do proper research, investigate the sites, the characters of the varieties, and obviously have a philosophy of making the wine, have an approach, have a sensitivity in how we make those wines.
Yeah, thank you very much. Charles, I'm going to bring you in here because I mean you've always been a prophet in your own lifetime, and you were ahead of the game here in terms of planting what so-called Mediterranean grape varieties. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you've got planted and your plans to plant other things? Are there other things that you're considering in the vineyards?
Tim, yes, unfortunately I've planted a lot, haven't been able to sell a lot of them. That's always the challenge. You work so hard to try and match the variety to the specific location, and you do it through research and a bit of traveling and tasting and stuff, and then you get the right combination, but the market's not ready for accepting a whole range of other varieties. Let's just take Malbec, for instance. Does exceptionally well in certain parts of South Africa, but it's Argentinian owned, and the same to the degree with Shiraz is Aussie. So it's very difficult to find what's going to. I agree with Adi. The drought had a major effect, and global warming is going to change the way we think about stuff. And the bigger berry varieties, such as Grenache, is suited to the warmer areas, and I'm really focusing in the Swartland on Grenache. I think the challenge with South Africa is that we're in the oldest new world producing country, or the newest old world country. It's very difficult to find out where we fit in. And to go back to what Trizan said about the aspect, location, elevation, our soil types. On one farm, I unfortunately farm about 500 hectares of vineyard, okay? And I got more than 500 different soil types. That's a problem with South Africa. Don't have homogeneous stretches of land like you would find in Chile, Argentina, and Australia, where you can make a specific style to a specific price point and do it successfully year on year. Our terroir is so diverse, and now we have to find those varieties that work on this rich tapestry of terroir. And I think the way forward is going to definitely be blends. Rather than single varieties. If we had a bigger local wine consuming culture and tradition, South African wine would look completely differently. You would get Swartland wine would be driven Shiraz, Grenache, Mourvèdre, Carignan, and a couple of the other varieties that Adi is alluding to. You'd find Stellenbosch that would be Bordeaux-orientated Cabernet Merlot in a blend. We've got Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in the Hemel and Arder Valley. And right down the south coast and the east coast would be Sauvignon Blanc. So that's what South Africa should look like. Unfortunately, it's going to take a long time to get there.
Okay, so briefly, I just want to cover old vines. I mean, before we move on to winemaking specifically, Minardi mentioned old vines. There's a lot of focus on old vines at the moment in South Africa, and the Old Vine Project, obviously with Andre Morgenthal and Rosa Kruger, has done an amazing job. Neil, I just want to bring you in quickly on this, and then Adi. what are the advantages and disadvantages of working with old vine fruit? And do you have to grow them, but specifically vinify them in a different way?
Right, so I think with old vine, we need to keep in mind that with old vine normally comes lower yields. So at the end of the day, it's still about making money. So you need to have a label that justifies the old vine, so that sells at the correct retail price. So to have it all sustainable all the way through, to keep the old vine in the soil. So to do that, you then specifically do grow them differently. Obviously, you take care of every bunch that you've got. They're mostly rootstock, mostly bush vines, still that we work with. So and you try and renew as far as possible in the vineyards. And then when it comes to the winery, you do keep it separate, because it's going to end up in a separate bottle, in a separate label, and you're trying to express what the old vine is showing you, and not overpower it with oak. And yeah, so fermenting in older barrels or in cement or concrete, tanks, those are all the type of things that you would do, but you would treat it differently and special, purely not just because of the old wine, also because of the price point that you're expecting to get from these older vineyards to make them sustainable.
Okay, thank you very much. Ardi, just your approach to old vines, how you farm them, first of all, very quickly, but then also, do you specifically vinify them in a slightly different way?
So no, I mean, I think old vines are quite emotive. Huh? They look amazing. They're extremely photogenic. People love touching them and looking at them. But yeah, they do have advantages and disadvantages, you know, as Neil alluded to, low yields. But what does make them quite amazing is in our climate, their resilience, you know, and their buffering capacity to the climatic changes, the heats of the summer. And you know, with that goes a relative consistency of yield, consistency of juice analysis. Young vineyards in the same situation, you know, we've got interplanted and old vineyards. The young vines just really struggle, and we had to pick a lot earlier than the old vines. So, but growing wise, the most important thing we find with the old vines is the pruning. Really important to prune properly. We don't make very big pruning wounds. We try and, I don't know, prune where there is growth. We don't necessarily prune how we were taught to prune, by cutting back the second year wood. We leave where there's good sap, where we can see there's good sap flow, energy, whatever you want to call it. And then obviously suckering and crop management. Those are very important. But physiologically, you know, it's green, it's got roots, it grows, but it does grow differently. And I don't know, I'm a bit of like a chemical dwarf, you know, when it comes to understanding chemistry and stuff. But there is just something, and I don't know if I'm like a guy standing in Chevry Chambertin and I can't separate the legend of the place from what I'm actually tasting. But when I taste the juice of these wines, you know, I really think there's something different in the juice, just a depth of flavor that isn't in the young vines. And that's why we try and keep them separate as far as possible. If it's a vineyard we're bottling on its own, try to be sensible with oak and how long we mature it for.
Okay, fantastic. I mean, it's interesting what you were saying about pruning, that you're almost pruning, you know, vine by vine, aren't you? That each vine is a separate entity, personality, or whatever. I mean,
as they become older, they become even more individual. You know, when you bottle wines on their own as well from single vineyards, same varietal. In the beginning, they're closer to each other, but as they age, they become a lot more different. And same with the old vines, I think.
Yeah. I mean, Carl Schultz, who's at Hartenberg, one of his lines is harvest it, don't recipe it. In other words, you know, you're actually thinking about specific vintages and how they're reflected in the vineyards. Before we move on to winemaking, just one more thing I want to ask, and I think we've sort of covered this, but I just wanted to get Craig and Trizan in again. One of the criticisms of young guns, and Trizan, you're a young gun, I'm certainly not anymore, is that they don't own their own fruit. You know, it's one of the things that the old, you know, some of the slightly more dismissive people say, oh, they don't own their own fruit. how important is it? I mean, you two, Craig, you do, Trizan, you don't. Trizan, is it tricky to keep the growers in line? How do you do it?
Tim, I think I might have been fortunate working with the Elam farmers and having sourced from them now for the last 13 years. So I haven't had any difficulty. So, you know, I don't own my own grapes. And if you're asking, you know, which one is important, you know, it really depends on your objective, you know, where you want to go with your wines and your portfolio. And I think I have a long-standing relationship with my farmers. I'm not, you know, signed into contract or anything. It's really like a relationship with them. And just been fortunate to be able to source from the same blocks every year for the last 13 years. Yeah. Sure, there's some calculated risk because you can lose that. A big contractor can come in and sign off all the blocks. But I guess it's the same calculated risk by owning your own vineyards and having a bad vintage, you know, and not having any source to any other fruit. Whereas where I'm buying and I can source somewhere else. So I think it's both sides. It goes both sides, and it really depends on you and your relationships with your farmers.
Yeah, thank you. Craig, are there any vintages you've had where you thought, oh God, I wish I could buy fruit? And they're the vintages where you thought, I'm so glad I've got my own grapes.
I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. You know, it's to buy fruit, say, brings in a certain amount of freedom because you're able to source from anywhere, essentially, as long as there's a willing seller. Whereas us guys who are farming, you know, we're restricted to one patch of earth, and I can guarantee you that there's a better Chardonnay vineyard somewhere else or a better Cabernet vineyard somewhere else. Yeah. But I work with what I've got. But I think I can only talk about my personal sort of rationale, motivation behind it, and I think it's one driven by what this is all about. You know, I'm not a young gun. I'm not that young anymore, and we made a very conscious decision, you know, Anne and I, about 16, 17 years ago, that we wanted to create something that was going to live longer than the two of us. Otherwise, we kind of wondered what we were doing it for, if it was going to end when we ended. So we took a decision to purchase the property in the Himmelin Aarde, and then to go on to a slow but sure planting regime. So, you know, initially we had 4 or 5 hectares. We now at about 18 hectares. They're not all in production, but they're there. And there's a longer term thought process in terms of the next generation or the generation after that. You know, if our children who are they're young adults now, if they decide that they're going to get into this business and continue the farming practice, you know, when they're my age, they're going to have 25, 30-year-old virus-free vines to work with. Yeah. And that's something quite special. So, you know, I guess there's also a financial aspect. It's really expensive to plant your own, to buy your own land, plant your vines. It's a really long-term thing. You've got to be totally committed. And I think one of the biggest fundamentals for me personally anyway is I much prefer being a farmer than a winemaker. So I would really rather think of myself as a wine grower. I'm not highly educated and skilled at the art of chemistry and winemaking per se, but I love to walk through my vineyards. I love to prune the vineyards. I love to watch them grow. And I think you know, there's a lot of enjoyment, personal enjoyment that comes out in that. It's a lot of food for the soul, walking through your vineyards and knowing that they're going to be there for quite a few generations.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think sometimes there's this slightly artificial distinction between a grape grower and a winemaker. Obviously, there are people who are just growers in South Africa and people who are just winemakers, but a lot of the best people are a bit of both, I think, you know, not just with their own vines, but also, Trizan, you're very heavily involved in the grapes that you buy, you know, in picking decisions and other things, obviously, yield and pruning, all those sorts of things. Let's move on to winemaking now, and I'd like to bring Ardi back in and Neil. Just many people think of 1994 with the democratic elections as being a bit of a tipping point. And if you know, South Africa was more open to travel and more open in all sorts of ways, really. Just Adi, I want maybe start with you. Just talk about the biggest changes you've seen in winemaking in that time. I know it's a huge question, but you know, oak uses, maceration times, alcohol levels. Margaret Rands asked a question about whole bunch usage. You know, can we generalize about an industry and say that the industry's changed in this respect, or is it down to individual producers?
No, Tim, I mean, I think one can generalize. You said 1994. I mean, I think that was, you know, the last year Chateau Libertas was really, really good. Yeah. You know, we drink a lot of old South African wines. I've got a friend of mine, Kali Low, who farms at Porcelainberg, that you know. A lot of old wines from the 60s and 70s, amazing wines. You know, since the 90s, there's been a massive increase in the quality of wines across the board. And I think the major thing was, you know, obviously the big cooperatives, the big players, were suddenly making wine for a market, for a customer, had inputs from outside. You know, technology was ramped up, viticulture was ramped up, a virus eradication program became very, very serious and very focused. So viticulture improved, winemaking improved, and wines are made for consumers. Obviously, you know, Charles spoke earlier about the lifting of the quota system. So new areas have been explored. You know, when my first job was at Grote Post for Nick Pence up in Darling, and that was also just opened up after the quota system, and it was an amazing area. It's an incredible place for growing grapes. You know, and you know, so site expression is there. There's a much more varied tapestry now to play with for winemakers and farmers. You also asked something about, I don't know, picking dates and all that. Yeah. I don't know, Tim. I mean, it's very, very difficult to generalize around that. But I think winemakers are becoming a little bit more aware of picking dates, picking a little bit earlier, realizing that, you know, alcohols of 15 and a half are very difficult to drink, to consume, and that, you know, you're getting really nice fruit spectrum and nice tannins on reds at 13 and a half to just under 14, I think. And the use of oak has also really been understood, you know, much better. You know, if you take a place like Burgundy, which is a lot of our inspirations, and people, when they look at Burgundy from a terroir point of view, just two varietals, you know, there's so much consistency in year to year in the winemaking approach. You know, the yields may vary. So the guys are using similar oak regimes, working with the same vineyards. And I think as soon as that becomes more prevalent in South Africa, you're going to see much bigger differences in the different sites. Yeah. As winemakers decide, okay, this works. Yeah. For us, for example, we want to focus on blends, different blends, and try and move away from varietal mixes. But, you know, we're trying hard to get a style and an approach of winemaking. And I think, you know, it's going to become more and more prevalent on a smaller scale, but on a large scale where we need to sell wine to consumers, the quality is going to be very, very good. I don't know. I think it's very exciting what we're going to see in the next couple of years out of this country, just in terms of varietal mixes, but also just the basic quality of wines.
Yeah, and I think in terms of winemaking, Evan Sardi talks about it's the difference between making tea and coffee. That coffee is a more extractive process and tea is a slightly gentler process.
Yeah. So when maceration times are being considered, you know, it's time on skins versus extraction.
Yeah. Neil, one thing I want to just ask you about is, we're not, but I think Adi, you alluded to it. You know, it's certainly in the 90s, maybe into the early 2000s, you know, South Africa could have gone down one of two routes. It could have gone then the prevailing sort of New World model, which was heavily influenced by what's happening in the States, particularly American critics, also in Australia, I think, that big Shiraz mold. And it kind of turned away from that. I mean, would that be a correct interpretation by me, or am I talking rubbish? I'm not sure.
I think it is a correct interpretation. If it was done with intent, I'm not sure. So I'm happy for the route that we did go, and it's purely because of our resources. I mean, we haven't got the virgin soils of Australia where there's kilometers of exactly the same soil type. I mean, Charles mentioned you've got a tapestry of different soil types. So to have optimum ripeness or even growing is not that easy in South Africa for making big blends. I mean, we'll rather be a smaller blend producer and have multiples of those, I think, if it fits to our tapestry. But yeah, it's not good to be pigeonholed. I think they've burnt their fingers as well, from the era of Parker, of the no wood, no good, to the big Australian blends, and being said that that's the only thing that you can do. We need to be careful in South Africa that we don't push. I mean, I love Shannon, but Shannon is a conversation starter. We've got so much more than just Shannon. So let's not pigeonhole ourselves and say, okay, that's what the country focuses on. And then I think that's definitely coming through with the newer producers, the older producers as well, that there's a united voice of just everything that we can do, and what we do and gets put outside there has been strictly looked at. It is governed properly by the Wine and Spirits Board, and it's beautiful wines. I mean, you don't pick up bad quality wines really in South Africa anymore.
Tell us a little bit about. I mean, we've talked about winemaking changes, and I think we're all agreeing on that to a certain degree. Just tell us what it's like working with a very big producer, and you're obviously thinking about the market. You know, what do consumers want? Charles has alluded to this and said, okay, fine, he may want to plant into Barocca or Touriga Nacional, but if there's not somebody at the end of the chain who's going to buy it, do you find that, you know, are consumers picking up on these winemaking changes and liking them, or do they still want some different styles?
It again depends on what your definition of the market is. If your definition of the market, where South Africa does relatively well, being the UK, then it's grosser. So then it's still your big varietals that are the whips there. If you look at Scandinavia, where there's a lot of tenders being won, then it depends on what the tender is written for. And there's again more organic and alternative packaging that's being focused on. So I think for you to stay relevant is the most important thing, and that means adapting to the seller. What's strange for me is that we've gone through the phase of all the modern technology, and you can take out and add everything to wine, but we're actually moving into a phase again of not wanting to do anything to the wine, which I love. I mean, the more you go back into history. So yeah, if I had a superpower, I think time travel would have been one of them, but wanting to see what winemaking was like in the 1960s or the 1950s. Well,
it's interesting that, you know, tasting some of those old wines, I've been lucky enough to do that in the Tabernacle, you know, from the 60s and 70s, as Adi said, they were not unlike some of the wines being made now. I mean, you know, probably what's being made now is a bit cleaner and is certainly expressing different places, but in terms of lightness of alcohol and balance and not using masses of new wood, I mean, almost the period from 1990 to 2005 was an anomaly, I think, in South Africa. Those bigger, not everybody's making, some people still making them, but I would say they're exceptions now.
But to answer your question on new varieties will be driven by the market, and I know it's a two-edged sword, but I mean, just in my experience, you need to stand at a wine show at least for a couple of hours before people are convinced to come and taste your Viognier, just because they can't they don't know how to pronounce it. They need it for a couple of glasses before they can pronounce that. So when it comes to Verdelho and all of those things, I'm not sure how they're going to pronounce it. They don't want to, without not knowing.
Yeah, what we've done with, you know, anything we look, a lot of the stuff is unpronounceable, these names, but if you can't pronounce it, you call it Sinsa or Shannon. As long as it's in the wine, you know, that's the main thing. Look, mostly our back labels shouldn't be taken as the gospel, but I think it shouldn't stop us from exploring. You know, if you can't pronounce it, call it something simple. You know, I think most of those things really give you a stump, a sore tongue.
Thank you very much. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Then just ask the panelists, if you're not speaking, could you mute yourself, please, so that we don't get any feedback? That would be great. And the next thing I want to talk about is kind of low tech, and maybe we could bring Margaret Rand's question in here about whole bunches. I mean, my good friend Leon Kutzia from the Fledge talks about treating his wines with loving neglect. Another very successful brand is obviously Bloodite from Niels Verberg, and Niels is has made a virtue out of this minimal intervention style. I just wonder, how funky should South Africa go? How minimal should it go? How should it push boundaries? Charles, I want to bring you in here because I know you're working, I think the first person to do this, with Quevery, that you were influenced by going on a trip to Georgia, and you've sent Charles over there as well, your winemaker at Spice Route. Just tell us a little bit about how funky you're prepared to be.
I don't do
Very,
funk. Funk's a nice way of hiding a lot of faults. It could be Brett, it could be aldehyde, it could be HTS, it could be oxidized, it could be anything of those and a blend of all of those. So I like to express the purity of what you're trying to do without overwooding or out having any of these funky attributes I just alluded to. I think they're winemaking faults. Having said that, I'm prepared to go whole bunches with stalks into a Quevery, which is a clay pot which you bury in the earth, and leave the wine there for 6 months on the stalks. And provided I take it out as clean, true to type, and as pure, and it reflects where it comes from or the variety. And that's the parameters I like to work within. So I like minimalistic winemaking, but with strict discipline, hygiene, and within the process to hold everything together.
Yeah, I mean, I know Joe Locke's watching today, and Joe is bringing those wines in, which is great. Or certainly one of them. So again, they've found a market. Which is the point you made earlier about if these things don't have a market, it doesn't really.
I remember, I started Gamay in South Africa, Gamay Noir, the Beaujolais variety, and that was in the early 80s or late 70s, I can't recall. And there we did the carbonic maceration. And we filled the tank with whole bunches. And that was the start of a whole new movement in my winemaking, where by introducing fruit in the late 80s, a large part or a third of the tank of every macerating tank was carbonic maceration at the bottom. So we put whole bunches at the bottom, which added flavor, fruit component, also helped drain the juice off when you prepared for pressing. So we could use whole grapes into our winemaking process more than 30 years ago.
Yeah. Interesting. Trizan, tell us a little bit about how funk works for you. I mean, do you like to really control what's going on, or are you just happy with things to take a little bit of their own course with things like natural yeast fermentations?
Tim, I think echo Neil and Charles that it's almost like back to basics. And I'm actually quite a lazy winemaker, so I kind of guide the grapes into doing their own thing. I think if you start out with healthy grapes, you're less likely to go the funky way. But that said, I think it's an interesting time into making wines, and I think there are young guns that are pushing boundaries. But in the end, I find that my wines are an extension of myself, and I need to be able to stand in front of people and sell my wines, and they've got to believe in my wines. And if your wines are truly funky and almost undrinkable, you've got to sell those wines, And so I keep it fairly simple. Yes, I'm aware of technical faults, and I don't necessarily like that in my wine. So try and keep it clean, but keep it as simple as possible.
I mean that natural, for want of a better word, movement in South Africa is small, but it's important, and it does make a lot of noise, doesn't it? And I just wonder how much influence that's having on the broader wine industry.
Well, natural. If I had to go back on my wines, I don't add anything to my wines. I don't add yeast to my wines. I don't adjust any acids to my wines. I don't fine my wines. But I do filter, and I do add sulfur. So how natural is natural? So I think that it is extremely important. I think we want different nuances in in our wine industry, to keep it interesting. It would be extremely boring if we made it all the same way.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Craig, you tell it, just quickly come in if you're listening. You've dabbled a bit in natural wines, i.e. without added sulfur, haven't you? Just tell us a little bit about that wine, could you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's important to just note from our side at Restus, I mentioned earlier that I'm not a trained winemaker. So when I started making wine, I think the first vintage was 2005. I did very, very little to the wines, and it worked, and I've stuck with that whole approach, and it's become part of my philosophy in terms of trying to express my vineyards. So I'm a strong believer in minimal intervention. And just to answer your question, when I first started making wines, I came across this substance called sulfur in terms of in liquid form. And the guys would put sulfur into their wines, and I was told, no, you put a bit of this into the tank to do X, Y, and Z, or to make sure you don't get high VA or something like that. And I took the lid off the can, and I took a big sniff of this stuff, and it nearly killed me. And I've hated it ever since. So in the beginning, when I was really anti-sulfur, I wasn't really familiar with wine movements per se in terms of what was trendy or what wasn't trendy. I just knew what I liked and didn't like. And I thought sulfur was poison. And so I didn't want to use it in my wine. So I didn't. So those first wines, they were initially okay, but they did sort of start crashing a few years down the line, 5-6 years down the line, they started crashing. And since then, sulfur and I have become better friends. I've started understanding more about the chemistry behind what's going on there. But having said that, I still work in a very, very minimalist, non-interventionist way, much like Trizon was saying earlier. There's no chemicals in my cellar. There is a little bit of sulfur. I don't really do punch downs or pump overs. It's very much an infusion across the board. With my Chardonnay, for example, I work with a very old Vaseline press, oxidize the hell out of the Chardonnay. It goes like Coca-Cola. I then ferment it like that without any sulfur. The first time my Chardonnay sees sulfur is after primary fermentation, which can be anything up to 60 days. So I think, and also Charles, I really enjoyed what he said earlier in terms of the sort of wine faults or funkiness, et cetera, and that sulfur definitely plays a role in that. I agree with Charles in the sense that I think wine should be pure and healthy and clean. I don't like weird flavors, or I don't really like cloudy wine that much, just because it looks horrible. But I think that there will always be a market for everything. But if you're going to sell your wines on a larger scale, which we don't, if you are going to sell your wine on a larger scale, the consumer demands certain standards. But yeah, I think that wine should smell great, taste great, look great. And if you can do that with very little sulfur, then do it. Okay. It'll be more work, but it's worth it.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to look at influences on winemaking, external influences. I mean, South Africa has not suffered quite so much, suffered as probably inverted commas, from international consultants. The influence of international consultants, they were huge in Argentina and in Chile, but probably less so, I think, in South Africa. I just wonder, where does South Africa look to externally for its inspiration? I mean, Charles mentioned this thing about being between the old world and the new world. Maybe it was Neil. Where does the inspiration come from? Let's have Neil. Could you address that for us? Just what inspires South Africa? Are there other countries that do it?
Well, I don't want to generalize. I'll speak for myself. I think when it comes to inspiration, obviously the French were here to bring the technology, or not the technology, just the whole culture. But for me, going to the old world, it's always interesting to learn about the history of wine and to reignite your passion and your thinking cap gets put on. When it comes to technology influences, then I think Australia is sometimes ahead. So if you really want to go for the best technology, Australia and even America or some parts of Spain would really give you some good technology for your wineries. But yeah, it really depends on what you need. At the end of the day, you need to still make it South African. So with and be true to yourself. So and not try and copy, listen, learn, feel with your eyes, and yeah, then bring and make it your own.
I mean, I think one of the big differences in my time visiting South Africa has been this sort of building of self-confidence. Instead of saying we're like X or we're trying to make a copy of or a version of, now I think a lot of the best winemakers are saying we're making South African wine. Not that we make wine that tastes like Bordeaux in Stellenbosch or like Burgundy if you're in the Heavenada Valley or Elgin. Would that be true?
That 100%. There's definitely a tendency towards that, and it's also been ignited by wine tourism. I mean, a tourist doesn't come here to come and taste a variety that tastes like something that's in Italy. I mean, you want it to taste like the South African expression of a varietal. So no, definitely, you're 100% spot on there.
Yeah, Craig, bring you back in. Just particularly the influence of Burgundy. Is that the biggest influence, especially where you guys are based? I mean, we'll leave the Cabernet on one side and look at Pinot and Chardonnay maybe.
Look, I think I often get asked that question. I think the influence is more an approach than an actual
place,
smell, etc.
Yeah.
I don't think we're ever trying to imitate another person's or region's wines, but we can certainly subscribe to their thoughts, traditions, philosophies about their holistic approach towards the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then I think things worked in trends as well. That's been my observation so far. So sometimes certain areas, regions will become popular because that style of wine has become popular. If you look at New Zealand, I'm pretty sure Cape Point would have loved to have been a cloudy bay. New Zealand's stamped their name on Sauvignon Blanc. Australia did a great job at stamping their name on Syrah. I know Charles again touched on this earlier. So I think those type of the countries like that had a confidence in themselves to take ownership of something, and I think we need to learn from that. Australia took ownership of Syrah Shiraz, actually more so in terms of the style, and put it out into the world and proudly put their product out there. And then legends like Penfold, Grange, etc. were born. So I think that we really need to be a lot more confident in what we're doing. I think we need to charge higher prices for what we're doing. People don't take you seriously if you're cheap. And we just got to get that message out there. But it's also positive at the moment. I think our wine industry is in a fantastic space. I think guys like Artie, the Molyneux, Eben, Duncan, there are a lot of those guys that were around from sort of 2005 onwards that started pushing things. And I think you'll find forums like this in other countries where they're discussing what the impression South Africa has made on them in the last 10 years. So I think we've got it right in a certain band, and that will filter down into the bigger brands. Yeah. But I certainly think that there's a core of really significant winemakers and approaches that are happening, Trizans in that mix as well. Yeah. That are doing things right, who aren't apologetic for what they're doing, who know their stuff good, who prepare to charge the price that puts the value on that product, and that is exciting. And on the international circuit that I've been on over the last 7 or 8 years, the South African stands are by far the most popular. Yeah. People are seriously interested in what we're doing, and we'll be doing some amazing stuff. And I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, and they're also fun, the South African stands, to be around. I mean,
yeah, because we just we drink and get drunk.
Nothing to do with the quality of the wines. Just one quick thing. I mean, before we move on to the commercial side of it. I know Charles is starting to talk about this at some point, who actually sells his wines to. Just a little mention for new areas, the development of new areas. I mean, it seems to me that new areas are being developed at altitude. I mean, as Trizan mentioned, closer to the ocean, obviously, and also in areas with this significant summer rainfall, okay, which has obviously been an issue with the 4-year drought that we had. I mean, Ardy, do you just want to quickly chat about that, about, you know, new areas you'd be looking at? I mean, are you just going to be married to the Swartland forever, or do you thinking, yeah, I quite like what's going on in, I don't know, in the Ceres Plateau, or Sutherland, or Stamford, or you know, Langeberg Garcia, or Utaniqua, any of these areas?
You know, Tim, I love to go and visit Craig, Himlin Arder Valley. You know, the old winemaker at Rustenburg Wines in the 70s, Reg Nicholson. He always said you never harvest Cabernet before the first Grand Prix. And I mean, Craig, you like a month and a half after that. I think it's really, really difficult where you're producing grapes. It's extreme. You know, I'm really in love with the Swartland. We did, you know, buy a little bit of fruit from Ceres up on the plateau, but you know, that was just a knee-jerk reaction to a lot of people buying grapes here in the Swartland, and it happened to be away to an amazing river, fishing river. No, look, there is huge potential. There's so many exciting areas, but you know, Tim, I'm focused on just working on this farm with these, you know, mostly just one type of soil, which is granite, you know, and that's it.
We not really mentioned soil type. I mean, I think it's Neil who was talking about saying how many different, Charles, you were saying, weren't you, in your plantings, how many different soil types there were. I mean, are we seeing wines expressing soil type? I mean, not just the general idea of terroir, but specific soil type. Charles, do you want to just mention that? Just whether soils?
Yeah, just to step back one, I was listening to what you said earlier about where we draw our inspiration from. And incidentally, last night I was watching a program on Elvis Presley, of all people, and he drew from jazz, blues, and gospel. And I almost think South African wine business is sort of the early career of Elvis Presley. We're just starting to be discovered, and we've drawn on all these different regions around the world and made it our own, and coming up with a unique tune that resonates with our terroir and our environment. So I think that's that side. Soil types.
We just don't want you to go late career Elvis, do we? We don't want Las Vegas Elvis.
No, we'll stick to the middle part. The soil types, I mean, I think the big changes in South Africa are going to be on viticultural technology. And in that is going to be the whole rediscovery of the soil type and what rootstocks are going to work where, especially with the pressure of drought. But it has an amazing effect. I mean, if you take Fairview, which is decomposed granite on the mountain slope, and duplex sandy soils in the valley floor, and they adjacent to one another. And in fact, I don't grow wine on sand anymore. I've moved it all up to the mountainside. So it's a dramatic effect on the quality of what you're doing, especially the water holding capacity in Ardy's area in the Swartland, the water holding capacity of the soil, because they must soak up in the winter like a sponge, sufficient water to carry them through the summer. So it makes it's the single most important factor in wine growing. Is your soil.
Thank you very much. And we're going to move on now to the market, basically selling your wines. Maybe Ardy, come back to you, because you're very good at marketing your wines to various people. Just how important is it to please the market and possibly critics? I mean, I know nobody pays any attention to what we say, but anyway, when we're making wine, who are you trying to please? I mean, can you make wine that just please yourself and then sell them?
Tim, obviously, I mean, like now, which critic must we listen to? You know, you guys all speak a different language, and you know, when you're selling wine all over the world, you realize that, you know, people speak different languages. Their terminology is completely different. If you know, Craig mentioned Oslo earlier with the banana tree. If you go to Oslo, and these guys taste this wine and they said, oh, this is really, really juicy. When I taste that wine, that thing is tart, acidic, it's unripe fruit, but that's their point of reference. They can't ripen their own fruit there, whereas juiciness in South Africa has got a completely different term, so a meaning. So you must first understand, I think, your market you're selling to, how they understand wines. But of course, it's very important that the wines we make are enjoyed by the consumers. That being said, we are also working with varietals, and we're very fortunate to work with varietals like, in our whites is mainly Chenin Blanc. That is just an amazing varietal. It's very diverse, and blended with other varieties, it makes something really, really approachable, drinkable. It can make it very complex. You can, for example, our white blend is a blend of 17 different vineyards, but it's Chenin based. There's a lot of pleasing aspects in there, but there's a lot of complexity as well. And on the red side, we're also fortunate to be working with grapes like Grenache and Cinsault and Shiraz. They're really drinkable, they're approachable, and they can show huge diversity. With the very old Cinsault blocks and the very old Grenache, they can really show a sense of place strongly, whereas the younger stuff, it's just drinkable and pleasing. So we're very fortunate in that aspect, that we're working already with varietals that are easy to drink, easy to understand. If I was working with Montepulciano here, I'd really, with a tannin on a thing like that, we'd really have to decide, okay, we're going to sell it to this market. This is going to be the style. So we're pretty much freed from that, luckily.
Yeah. I mean, you're not at the point, you've never made a wine for a specific market, have you? I know you make some wines, for supermarkets or whatever. I mean, would you ever make a Norwegian cuvee and think, right, is this going to be really tart?
No, not really. Tim, we have bottled, we have, Trizan mentioned earlier, we chatted a bit about the so-called natural wines and things. So we do make wines like that, and but bits and pieces, because we also do remember that, the audience that we sell to, there's another audience out there as well whose point of reference is these natural wines. And it's something you really need to take cognizance of and recognize it. But also, what is the point of wine? It's to preserve grape juice, but in a nice form, So if it's done well and it's preserved properly, it doesn't need all these additives, as Craig said, But if it's just wine that's thrown together without care and thought, then it's not going to preserve very well. But we make cuvées of various things, but not specifically just to please markets. We make what we like, and so far, like touch wood, it's been all right.
And what about things? Let's bring Trizan on this. Who are you making wine for? Do you have to please yourself first and foremost?
I think, Tim, with my wines, my niche wines, I'm led by the grapes, and I'm led by the wines, and then I lead by my wines. So I'm not going to look for the market and make it. I almost take my wines to the market that way around, rather than going to get a market and then make a wine for that market.
Okay, yeah.
It depends. As producers, so you get your bigger bulk wine producers that are producing for your supermarkets, and they are led by consumer, by price point, by style, and what's going on in the global market. So there are these, there's two different markets that we're playing here. I think most of us on this panel are leading with our wines into a certain market, because we are talking about the authenticity of this of the place of where the wines are from. But there's this bigger other market, and I don't think there's right or wrong. It's the diversity of our wine industry, and it makes it interesting.
Maybe just bring Neil in on this as well, because he's selling or making larger volumes in some cases. Neil, do you ever think at Nederburg and Distel about making specific wines for a specific market? The South African market, for example, with more residual sugar, which often tends to be popular in bigger blends?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you need to start with the market and with consumer insights, and then you work your way back. I mean, if you don't do that, then it's not going to work for us to sell more. And like you said, we've got some bigger blends and bigger brands, but I mean, I'll struggle to sell something that's my preferred choice to more than 1,000 people. If I need to have a blend that a bottle gets opened every 14 seconds, as we've got with something like Barnard, then you need to listen to the market and make it custom made for them. But what I don't do is I don't take the same blend and custom make it for multiple markets. So it will be the same wine that goes to different markets.
And these big volume blends, are they often a bit softer, a bit sweeter? And you know, oak. What about oak influence? Chips or staves or something? What's the?
It depends on. Yeah.
What is?
Sorry.
What's the recipe for success? I don't like the word recipe, but I can't think of a better way of putting it.
Well, there's no recipe for success. So what there is I think there's good hygiene factors. I mean, tasteability and accessibility is definitely the two elements that stands out. You don't want the person to taste the wine and his mouth starts shriveling up. I mean, you've lost him as a customer. But then it's about positioning. It's about your creative platform. It's about how you take it to market, your route to market. How much you're prepared to spend on getting it out there on shelf. So yeah, it's a big marketing exercise, and it's a combination of marketing, supply chain, winemaking, growers, and that's why it's so unfair. Or I always think it's so unfair for the winemaker to go and fetch the award at some, because there's that wine has touched a multiple amount of people actually, you know, that makes it come together. But big blends. In the SA context, yeah, if you look at something like 4th Street, for instance, it has got a higher residual sugar. Yeah. We should not underestimate a little bit of sugar. People love talking dry, but yeah, if you start analyzing the popular blends around the world, then there's a little bit of residual sugar, as long as it's in balance and not cloying.
Well, and it's surprising when people are honest. You know, I get text sheets and you look at something and you think, oh, this is nice and soft, and you look at the RS and it's sometimes, you know, 8 grams. I mean, I don't necessarily mean in South Africa, but specifically, but in other markets too. I mean, even, you know, Malbecs, a lot of commercial Malbecs have 8.
Yeah, for sure. As long as the wine is in balance and it hides a bit of tannins or the tannicness of the wine. I mean, so yeah, that sugar acid balance is always important. Yeah. And also to adjust it as the year goes on. I mean, if you're early with a vintage and you release it, it might need 8 grams, but in 6 months' time, the wine has come together a bit more, then you might only need 6 grams. So it's really about being close and staying close to your wine.
Okay, thank you very much. Final question, really, before we maybe just have a look at any questions from the floor, as it were. Just a little bit about stories and marketing wine and selling wine. You know, marketing is a slightly dirty word sometimes to journalists, but also to winemakers. You think, oh, that's the marketing department's job. I mean, how important is that in the broadest sense to what you do? Maybe Charles, because you're brilliant at marketing with you know, all your different brands. Yeah, how do you come up with these ideas, and how important to their success is the marketing?
No, I'm actually very bad at marketing, to be honest with you. I've been dead honest. It's our weakest point in our business. We sell ourselves too short. I think South Africa, let's rather talk about South Africa. We got 350 years of winemaking history, and we've got so many stories to tell. And just listening to this this interview that you've conducted, look how many stories popped out in this 1 hour. And we've got so much to tell, and there's never before been an opportunity globally where we can communicate as effectively as we do now on social media and online. So I think we just have to get it out there. And South Africa will be, I think, the next new wine craze. I see that on the rise, and it's on the way. Coming back to marketing, I'm a direct marketeer. I prefer to connect with my customers and do it via a big tourist destination, which resonates with people, capture their data here on the estate, and then engage them in the long-term relationship, and hopefully they buy wine over time. And the only way you can do that is, one, producing quality with integrity, because consumers can see through you so quickly today. So those two, quality and integrity of what you do. Environmentally friendly is going to become a more important aspect moving forward. And then you must have stories to tell. And then the stories must stack up when the person opens that bottle of wine and drinks it and has to buy into your brand philosophy. And that's simple marketing 101 as we understand it as Fairview.
Yeah, I mean, Fairview, I think I'm right in saying, is one of the top 3 tourist destinations in the Western Cape, isn't it? Or is it maybe you told me?
I do not know. It must have been good marketing.
I thought it was up there with Robben Island, and
I don't think it is. It could be in the top 10, most probably.
Top 10, but if you look at what you're doing there, you've got,
the way things are going now, might end up on Robben Island.
Yeah, but you've got the cheese, you've got the brewery, you're selling chocolates. It's a whole world. It's an ecosystem almost, isn't it, of marketing?
Yeah, well, that shows how difficult it is to market wine. If marketing wine was that easy, you would have one product, and that would be wine. It shows you wine must be one of the pillars of holding up a marketing strategy. A whole lot of other aspects play a role. Yeah. And that's why I've constructed in the way I have.
Okay, I mean, I think this question, because it's the last one, but also I think it's such an important question, I kind of like everybody to chip in. I was going to ask Craig, and I will ask Craig, but Adi, just you tell us a bit how I love your labels, I love your back labels, and humor is a very important part of what you do. I know you get pissed off when I say that, do people not take you seriously enough? But you do sell with humor, don't you?
Yeah, because humor was that's how I'm sort of put together. But the wines we make are very serious, the single vineyard stuff. But on the back labels, we'll say there in Afrikaans, we'll say, here comes your text about every wine, about how high and dry the vineyards are, and how they're irrigated with tears, just to take the piss, because everybody's got a story. But what's important is that that what is in the bottle stacks up with what people have heard, as Charles said. And we don't take ourselves too seriously. We're very focused on what we do farming wise and how we make wine. But we realize, as people, as human beings, the people that work here, we're not just defined by wine. We defined on how we treat other people, what we leave behind, I suppose, and that kind of thing. I mean, wine is just one aspect of our business. So that's the only thing we actually sell. But I don't know.
The vermouth, you sell vermouth as well.
Yeah, we sell a bit of vermouth, and but wine is the main thing. But it's just about I think Tim, just being honest and open and approachable, and having wines like that. I don't know how it's but how it's perceived.
Thank you, Trizan. Just importance of stories and marketing. I mean, to selling.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think what I've learned over the last couple of years is that people are really they're kind of interested in you and your story, and no matter what your story is, they kind of want a piece of you. And again, like Adi said, just to be honest and to connect with your audience in an authentic way. That's really, the wine comes after that. I find like people want to see you and connect with you and hear your stories. And I often find that when I tell people all the mistakes I've made in the winery, or how I blew up pumps and got like big rotor tanks derailed, that's the stuff they can love, because they can see, okay, well, people make massive mistakes and they're human, and that's how we connect. It's
like that.
With your
There's
audience.
a very good podcast in England called How to Fail, where the woman who does it interviews very famous people about where they've failed and how important failure was to success, in a way that, if you don't understand failure, you don't understand success.
Absolutely, and we learn by our mistakes. And I find when you share that with people, they get you and they appreciate that.
Yeah, I like that very much. Neil, quickly on to you, and then we'll finish up with Craig. Just the importance of stories, and particularly in a big business where it's, you know, maybe harder to get at individual personalities. I mean, you're a big personality in lots of ways, and you've certainly employed big personalities, like Lizelle, for example. How do you get those winemakers out in a big company?
Yeah, it's I think consistency is one of the most important things, and with a big company, the brand always comes first. I mean, it's a bit of an anomaly in South Africa that you know, that you make the winemaker the hero, with big brands. When it comes to the smaller brands, that the Ardis and the Trezans, I mean, it's ultimately, it is necessary to have the person bigger than the brand. Our brand home is quite important in our marketing mix. So I'll rather bring everybody to the brand home and let them experience South Africa. So because wine consumed on the spot is just, it's a memory for life. So and that's the secret.
Yourself, as it were. You're not selling Neil or Lizelle or whatever. Yeah.
No, we'll do it, and there needs to be a consistent messaging, but it's about selling South Africa wine, the farm, the Nederburg manner, and just the lifestyle.
Okay, good, thank you. Craig, over to you, the importance of stories and how you get the message out there. Need to unmute yourself. Craig, are you joining us? You need to unmute yourself.
I couldn't tell a story without speaking. Sorry. Look,
just wave your hands, right?
I think that what I realized is really easy to make wine. It's really difficult to sell wine.
Yeah.
So in terms of stories, I think for smaller producers like ourselves, I can't speak on behalf of the bigger guys, but certainly for smaller people like ourselves, it's about being able to connect. And we also have to realize we can't please all the people all the time. And if we try to, we're just going to sort of melt into this pool of mediocrity.
Yeah.
So first, you got to accept that not everyone's going to like what you do, and that's fine. But stories are hugely important. Like Trezan said as well, failure. You know, people want to know that you're a normal person just like they are. You just happen to be able to make wine. They can do other wonderful things. People are intimidated by wine. It can be a complicated. It can often be a sort of a language that they don't really understand, and it becomes intimidating, and they become fearful. They don't really want to talk up. So it's about just bringing it back down to earth, speaking simply, telling a story. You know, to go back to Trezan's topic on failure, I sound like I'm harping on about it, but I think it just demonstrates that we're infallible, just like everybody else. Not that we shouldn't be, but you know, my most
not infallible.
Yeah, sorry, infallible. My most talked about vintage of Cabernet was the one that no one's ever tasted. It's 2010. I emptied it into my dam. So, you know, I think it's just about being real, being authentic, do what you do, don't try to please everybody, but realize that, you know, if you've got a story to tell, you need to tell that story, and someone's going to like it, some might not.
I think that's a very good point on which to end. There are a few questions. I don't know if Joe wants to come in. I think we're on our hour and a half, and I'm aware that people have busy lives, not least the winemakers who are on the panel, who've done an amazing job. Thank you everybody for taking the time to do this. I thought your insights were amazing, and I think what you said, Craig, was at the end, it was a very nice way to end, really. Just do what you do, be honest, be accessible, and I think that's one of the great things about South Africa, that it is still accessible. It's not up itself, as it were, to use an Australianism on which to end. Joe, do you want to come in? Any questions you would like to take from the floor? I've been trying to keep my eye on them, but also been getting the best.
I think there's probably, if I can try and kind of summarize a few, the kind of role of lesser known varieties is something that a lot of our audience have touched upon, in that it can be of great interest to consumers, but is probably something that's more engaged consumers, but also whether those lesser varietals play a role, one, in climate change, and two, in maybe lower alcohol wines. So I don't know if there's one of our panel that would like to throw their hand up and touch on that.
Ardy's waving at us.
I mean, I think we have spoken about it, about the lesser known varietals, and Charles also said, how difficult it is to sell those things. But whether and I think there is a concerted effort and a keenness and a willingness from South African farmers and winemakers to explore different varietals based on their preempting climate change, of course. But as far as alcohol levels are concerned, that's up to the winemakers, to just pick a little bit earlier. It's really as simple as that. Yeah.
Any others, Joe? Unmute yourself, please.
Got it. So a question for Ardy, experimenting more with skin contact, white wines, orange wines. What's your learning from use of carbonic maceration skin contact for white grape varieties? And how does that relate to expressing terroir?
Yeah, Joe, so we have always, we make a brand called Secatier Chenin, a blend of many different vineyards, many, not styles of wine, most of it always traditionally made, fermented in concrete and wood. But we've always had a portion of that wine that was fermented on skins, either carbonic, and that was just added into the Secatier's Chenin Blanc, just to add another building block, another point of interest. And one of our agents tasted the wine before we made up the blend, and he really liked it, so we bottled some for him. And so we bottle a really small amount of white grapes fermented on skins. Some of them are destemmed, some of it's carbonic. And yeah, I mean, obviously that is the big debate. How can something that's fermented on skins carbonically, where the winemaking choice has got such a profound influence on a white grape that we normally associate with the Loire or South Africa, that's just normally pressed. It's very difficult to bring those two worlds together.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's quite answering your question in terms of the variety and its site expression. I don't believe that. I believe it's a winemaking. It's more winemaking approach.
There's one good question. I've just seen Roberto Bottega asking about ageability. Do we value ageability, or are we chasing immediacy? I don't know who wants to answer that. Maybe anybody put their hand up? No one. Charles, are you still there?
That's
Charles,
a hospital
you're still there. Ageability. Do we value ageability, particularly in the premium?
I just got a hospital pass now, just to go back.
That's why I invited you, because I knew you'd enjoy it.
But you guys should understand hospital passes far better than we do down here. Just to come back, just to add to what Ardy said about this maceration and the complete fermentation on skins negates and knocks out completely the influence of terroir. That becomes the overriding factor. However, grape varieties do play a role, and it's important to have very low pH when you come to natural wines. And then we would blend in a variety such as Petit Masseng, which has got a phenomenally high fixed acid and low pH, and that helps with the preservation of natural wine. Ageability today in the market, I don't know how many people cellar wines, put wines away. I think there was a survey done in the UK. You consume, I think, the wine probably 80% of them 48 hours after buying it. Something ridiculous like that. But there, I think one must have a portfolio of tiered approach, where you have wines that are worthy of maturation. And you must then connect with those customers who lay down wines. So in our portfolio, we have wines who lay down. There are other wines at the end, the bottom end, that doesn't need to be matured at all. And it's a total waste of time and capital having to mature them. So it depends on your portfolio that you put together. But I think every serious winemaker should have a portfolio whereby some of the wines are benefit with maturation. Otherwise, you're not going to do justice to our environment. Yeah.
So we won't be doing a vertical of Goats to Rome.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. I could always over deliver at the price point, my man.
Joe, any other final thoughts from you, or any other questions you want to pick up on?
Sorry, man, if I can just jump in there.
Sorry,
Sorry, man. I think it is very, very important to make wines that are age worthy. You know, we try. We don't know if they're going to age, but we keep back a nice percentage of each vintage of the wines we think are going to age well, because it's going to be interesting for, I don't know, my children or my grandchildren or whoever, just to see how the farm has progressed, how the vineyards have changed, you know, just to give a picture of a journey of a place, which I think is very important.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, you don't know where you've come from or where you're going to. You know, so, you know, we do have in our mind, obviously, we've got different wines, but seriously, I think I don't age a lot of wines. We keep 300-400 bottles of each vintage back that we can age. But I think it's a very important thing for the future, and to track your progress and see how you go. So it's a very important consideration for us.
Okay, that's probably a good point on which to end, isn't it, Joe? Unless there's anything you want to say, Joe. Final thoughts from you?
No, I think we're nearly 10 minutes over time. So from our side, I'd like to thank you, Tim, very, very much for chairing, and to our panel, Trizanne, Ardi, Charles, Craig, and Neil. Thank you so much. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but everybody can get in touch with Wines of South Africa if you do have questions that you need following up on. And otherwise, thank you from us, and over to you, Tim.
Well, just say thank you, really, everybody. South Africa is a place I love going to. I'll be back soon. Right, there we go. And see you all very soon. Thank you, guys, for doing such a great job. Ardi, for turning up on time. Amazing. See you, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.